So this is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Hélène Feder from the American University in Washington. So Hélène is you want to join me? Hélène is a professor of philosophy and social policy there. And she recently, in 2014, published a book on intersex, on the ethical implication, an ethical view of intersex. And the originality of her work was especially to focus on all people involved in the issue, the children, the parents, the doctors, trying to show the shared responsibilities within these relationships, extending all the way to our responsibility as a society to the children and parents who are involved in these issues. So I will now give you the floor. Thank you, Hélène, for starting this afternoon.
Thank you so much. I want to express my gratitude for the invitation to join you all this afternoon. I especially thank Anne Le Goff and Vanessa Nurok for their hard work and their powers of planning and patience. I wanted to apologize for the absence of a PowerPoint, but then I was informed that that's how it's done in France among philosophers, so I have no PowerPoint. So you're French. So I'm French. Over the past several months, I've been thinking about the place of curiosity in the care of infants and young children with atypical sex anatomies. We encounter various expressions of curiosity, positive and negative, in the recent history of what we also term intersex management. The awful effects of a negative or objectifying curiosity are readily apparent in the narratives that have been produced over the last 25 years by adults who, as children, experience what's called corrective genital surgeries and unnecessary normalizing interventions. The term normalizing is used clinically and critically, I should note. The positive sort of curiosity that Plato and Aristotle identified as the beginning of philosophy may not be as obvious in these narratives, but each constitutes an invitation to be curious about the experience of those who have been subject to practices that physicians have promoted without evidence of success for more than 5 decades. Examining the medicalization of intersex bodies and the resistance it produced through the lens of curiosity, I propose, may enrich our understanding of and appreciation for the moral violation that has seen increasing recognition. It may also present some surprises that challenge settled beliefs. I begin with a review of questions raised by the medicalization of intersex, some of which have already been touched upon, before turning to a discussion of the history of the role of psychologist John Money in the development of the protocol that resulted in what became the standard of care. While the damning history of Money's role has been a keen object of study, focusing our attention to the operation of curiosity may reveal that criticism of Money and his work has neglected positive moments that exemplify the best qualities of curiosity. But we may better appreciate, too, the reverberating consequences of the suppression of that curiosity. So let me begin again with subjects of curiosity. When I began to consider the place of curiosity in the context of the medicalization of intersex, I found the idea repellent. What immediately came to mind was image after image of medical students or doctors, residents gathered around an infant, child, or adolescent in a hospital room or surgical theater. When aspiring and new physicians are led, paraded, as a number of individuals have put it, through rounds to inspect atypical sex anatomies, their supervisors do not intend for for physicians in training to be surprised in the ways that René Descartes identifies with wonder, what he took to be the first of the passions of the soul, the emotion that, he wrote, disposes us to learn. Medicine is not, or at least not at this moment, a creative, wonder-filled scientific inquiry, but what we might see as a highly skilled trade, one that puts a high premium, furthermore, on dispassion in its practitioners. And yet physicians are interested in seeing intersex anatomies or other sorts of unusual anatomies precisely because they are not common. Wonder, too, is concerned with rarity or what is unusual. But wonder comes from noticing rarity. Having already taken note of the abnormality of intersex anatomies, medicine is no longer caught up in wonder, but in investigation and understanding. That is, in building knowledge. Narratives by intersex individuals, those that inaugurated an activist movement of resistance and continue to appear in print and online, attest to the harms of being the objects of a kind of prurient curiosity, as philosopher Iris Marion Young put it, and I quote, that converts the openness of wonder into a dominative desire to know. Continuous with this dominative desire to know is the startling lack of curiosity that specialists in the standard of care for intersex anatomies have demonstrated in response to stories of individuals who have spoken up about their experiences. Far from the success stories which case studies in the medical literature represented, intersex individuals, among them the very patients depicted in the medical literature, have conveyed how medical interventions have damaged their bodies and spirits. Individuals report chronic pain or dysfunction resulting from unnecessary surgeries to remove or reshape genitals that didn't conform to standards of assigned gender. Loss of reproductive function following gonadectomy was seen as critical to the successful sex assignment of some, in others being a suitable woman, justified clitorectomy. Many speak of trauma resulting from having their medical histories concealed from them, or because they recall too clearly the experience of clinical examinations intended to educate medical students and residents. As one former patient wrote, I still struggle to understand how it can be that medical professionals who seemed so interested in my care could have been so unaware of how their treatment had hurt me. How could it be that physicians who assert the primacy of the well-being of their patients turn away from evidence of harm, which their treatment appears to have produced? Wouldn't they want to know about the outcomes of treatment they have recommended or themselves administered? Painful and consistent, these stories are also, perhaps especially for those who encounter them for the first time, surprising. First, there is the fact of intersex, the knowledge that there are bodies that are neither clearly male nor clearly female. We learn then of the harms entailed by the medical management of these bodies. These are not only physical harms, which are substantial, but the psychological harms that originate in the secrecy and silence, and sometimes the outright deception, both of children and their parents, that has characterized the treatment of intersex bodies since the 1950s. Surprising, too, are the repeated opportunities and attendant failures by physicians and parents to recognize the wrong of these practices. In the face of these testimonies, and now in the increasing number of international statements condemning them, indeed, there has appeared to be no reduction in these practices worldwide. The fact that there has been no reduction in these practices worldwide, and in fact evidence suggests there is an increase, this itself is cause for wonder. How can it be that the same practices that appear so wrong to so many appear necessary and so right or good for others, and especially for the physicians and parents responsible for the well-being of children in their care. Perhaps more vexing still is the question of how physicians have remained confident in the standard of care, even as they failed to engage in follow-up studies of their work. If information concerning how patients have fared over the long term is inadequate, on what basis can they provide assurances to anxious parents who had been informed that their children's futures depended on surgical or hormonal intervention? Well, it turns out the design of responsible studies have presented problems. It wasn't clear, after all, how much patients knew about their diagnoses or the surgeries or treatments they had undergone. Even the parents who had consented to procedures might not be fully aware of the details of surgeries that had taken place in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. Daunting ethical problems in conducting outcomes research came to present apparently insurmountable barriers even for physicians who recognized the benefit of robust follow-up, even if only to substantiate their convictions that their patients would be counted among the happy, silent majority. Surely the positive results they could demonstrate would discredit the unhappy, vocal minority whose stories were raising doubts about the standard of care. Without good follow-up, most physicians have continued, nevertheless, to rely on the rationale for normalizing interventions formalized at Johns Hopkins University in the 1950s by psychologist John Money and his mentors, Joan and John Hampson. While there have been some changes in the standard of care beginning at the turn of the 21st century, and most notably this includes the routine reassignment of male children with micropenis to female, and Eric Verlaine can be credited with that in part. Despite these changes, which I think are really significant and important, unnecessary surgical intervention continues to today. So this is the second part. Getting curious. I'm hardly alone in the confusion I have experienced about the abiding confidence specialists demonstrate with respect to the importance of ensuring that the anatomies of children match their sex of assignment. After all, the validity of the standard of care would seem to have been seriously undermined, if not destroyed, following the 1997 revelation of Money's prolonged deception regarding the successful sex reassignment of an identical twin. This is known as the case of John Joan. Certainly, I was curious about the motivation of those specialists whose commitment to the standard of care appeared unchanged in the years following Money's marginalization in medical discussions of care for children with atypical sex anatomies. But in reflecting on the subject of curiosity, I realized that I had not been especially curious about John Money. On the one hand, that lack of curiosity, it doesn't seem especially surprising. He makes an excellent villain, as has been demonstrated in the book that journalist John Colapinto wrote after publishing the breaking story in Rolling Stone in 2000. Colapinto described how Joan, Brenda Reimer, had been living for some time as a man, now called David, who had married and was raising 2 children. A few years later, there was the BBC documentary, Dr. Money and the Boy with No Penis, that described David Reimer's suicide. His death, the narrator in the documentary intones, I won't try to reproduce the awesome British accent, was more than just a human tragedy. It was also a devastating blow to the reputation of the psychologist whose groundbreaking research on David had influenced a whole generation of scientists. Because some say that it was his unflinching belief in his theories that may have ultimately led to David's death. It doesn't seem quite right to claim that it was Money's belief in his theories that resulted in the death of David Reimer. The story that garnered Money so much renown, including a story in Time magazine, seems more like a function of a hunger for recognition so deep as to overwhelm other, also human needs, such as the ethical pull to tell the truth. The demonization of money satisfies the narrative arc of the tragic story of David Reimer and his family, as well as the stories of so many who have been affected by the medical management of atypical sex anatomies. My own discussions of Money's work have not been particularly nuanced with respect to his role in formalizing the medical approach to managing atypical sex anatomies in children. I have highlighted the apparent contradiction between the rationale for these protocols, which seem focused on ensuring a child's psychosocial well-being, and his conclusions regarding his study of 248 individuals with intersex that appeared in his doctoral dissertation. One would suppose, he wrote there, that the paradox of hermaphroditism would create a fertile source of psychosis and neurosis. The evidence, however, suggests that the incidence of the so-called functional psychoses in the most ambisexual of the hermaphrodites, those who could not help but be aware that they were sexually equivocal, was extraordinarily low. Colapinto and many following him see in this passage and the contradictions it reveals a culpable hypocrisy. Historian Alison Reddick's study of the development of the Johns Hopkins protocols, and especially of Money's role, provides another view, or at least begins to provide another view. She argues that the evidence Money gathered in his dissertation research did not directly challenge his own suppositions about what has been figured as Money's focus on the imperative to make intersex bodies conform to a social order organized by a rigid division of sex. On Reddick's account, the individuals with intersex who might appear to be the subject of his research and his dissertation were for him a means of finally settling debates about sexual difference. Rearing, he claimed, trumped all other influences, including the activity of hormones. The fact that the majority of hermaphrodites, as he called them, who had not been subject to surgical intervention, accepted their gender assignments without psychological disturbance, provided ample evidence for this conclusion. Money's dissertation, then, may be viewed principally as a theoretical work, notable for the radically new understanding of gender introduced there and elaborated in his better-known published works. Hermaphroditism lies at the center of this work because it was, as Reddick writes, and I quote, the perfect test case for his theory of gender. Not because he was interested in shaping a standard of care for infants and young children with atypical sex anatomies. Indeed, it was this theoretical rationale that Lawson Wilkins, the father of pediatric endocrinology, sought in Money and in Money's mentors, Joan and John Hampson, when he offered Money a fellowship at Hopkins. Wilkins had become acquainted with Money as he was completing his dissertation. Some of Money's cases, in fact, had come from Wilkins' clinic, where Wilkins had, only the year before Money's arrival in 1951, confirmed and was then refining the life-saving use of cortisol for the treatment of salt-losing congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is the most common condition resulting in atypical sex anatomies in genetic females, and in the salt-losing form, it's life-threatening. At Johns Hopkins, Money appears no longer to have been involved in the initial investigation and exploration of ideas about sex and gender, but in the formalization and defense of a theoretical framework. He turned, in other words, from a project that now strikes me as characterized by curiosity in the positive sense, namely in asking new questions in the face of surprising phenomena, and came to occupy a role at Johns Hopkins where his function was to consolidate and advance a theory that distinguished him as a pioneer in a new field in a leading medical institution. I want to be clear that my aim is not to excuse Money's actions, nor am I interested in telling a different story about the deception he engineered in the case of David Reimer and his family. We must not minimize the harm to which his work has contributed and that persists after his death. Rather, I propose to follow the hunch that the more complicated picture of money outlined in Reddick's research could offer insight into the promise of curiosity awakened on the one hand and the perilous risks of its suppression on the other. So this is the last section of the paper, Subjects of Curiosity 3, Investigating John Money. I was initially moved to question the soundness of my previous reflections on money, I should probably say assumptions about money and his legacy, after reading a narrative prepared by someone who called herself Peggy Cadet, whose narrative complicates the picture of money I had formed. Now a middle-aged woman, Cadet had initially been raised as a boy, but had struggled with that assignment throughout her childhood and young adulthood. She recalls that when she was around 21, she gained access to the medical record of a younger cousin, then 12 years old, with whom she shared an intersex condition. The record contained, and I quote, the verbatim transcript of her cousin's interview with Money, who, Cadet writes, offered sympathetic advice and explained clearly and frankly to her young cousin that he had choices. Cadet writes, Money not only told my cousin that he could change to being a girl instead of having a mastectomy, he gave him explicit information about intercourse, erotic sensation, homosexuality, transsexualism, all presented in language geared to a 12-year-old's understanding. These were choices that had never been presented to Cadet. Ironically, she recalls, the counselor I was seeing at that time cited Money's ideas as the rationale for my not having been informed in the same way as a child. Though Money had been, she writes, vilified for promoting a policy of secrecy and non-disclosure for intersex patients, in the case of my cousin, it appeared that he actually provided the sort of information and education intersex activists have argued for. Cadet's narrative finds significant confirmation in the memories of Tiger DeVore, one of the very first intersex activists and a clinical psychologist who sought a fellowship with Money as DeVore was completing his PhD in psychology. Despite enduring nearly annual surgeries for hypospadias repair throughout his childhood and young adulthood, DeVore had never met anyone who shared his experiences. He saw the prospect for that to change when, as a graduate student, he attended a lecture here at UCLA by psychologist Robert Stoller. Having encountered the diagnostic term hypospadias only in his own medical records, DeVore describes what seemed like a kind of thrill on seeing, projected on the overhead screen, with a transparency, his diagnosis, along with others describing different conditions that were not yet known, at least outside the halls of a clinic, as intersex. The promise of learning about others like himself, who had been born with sex anatomies judged in need of correction, led DeVore to ask for Stoller's help in recommending him for a position in Money's clinic. While Allison Reddick sometimes suggests that there was more to Money's thinking and work at Johns Hopkins than most have allowed, DeVore's account provides a view of Money that may help us join together some of the stray pieces in what is emerging as the larger, more complicated puzzle that is John Money, his work, and his legacy. He really cared about his patients, DeVore recounts. He connected with them and met them without judgment. Well aware of the harm that Money's work has done, and open about his deep disagreements with Money, both during his fellowship and long since, DeVore recalls the compassion Money displayed in his clinical practice. By his account, the empathic concern Money demonstrated was a product of his genuinely non-judgmental curiosity in the lives of many of those who came to the clinic, whose bodies or desires were taken at that time to be pathological. Like Cadet, Devore recalls Money's efforts to help his patients make adjustments that could provide them the space to express their desires and more safely make their way in the world. Money extended a warm welcome to his trainee, who made clear in his communications not only his qualifications to work at Johns Hopkins, but his specific motivation for seeking a spot in Money's clinic. Devore reports that Money was openly enthusiastic about having someone with an intersex condition as a clinical intern. Perhaps not surprisingly, he saw in Devore an opportunity to extend his own renown. Money arranged for Devore to be featured with him on a 1984 Baltimore talk show, interviewed by none other than Oprah Winfrey on People Are Talking, which Money heralded as the first television appearance by an intersex person speaking about their identity and experience. At the same time that Money sought to capitalize on his students' willingness to make public appearances, and so we may speculate, suggest Devore's endorsement of Money's work at Johns Hopkins, Money also took seriously his responsibility as a supervisor, encouraging in Devore the curiosity that appears to have characterized Money's early research. And that, according to Devore, was so evident in his clinical work with older teenagers and adults. This curiosity extended both to the clinic's patients and to Devore himself. Devore's reflections on what he saw of Money's clinical work provide a better sense of why many of Money's students and junior colleagues were so devoted to him during his life and remain eager still to defend his work since his death. In what is at least partly an effort to reckon with the uneasy legacy of Money's aspiration to create, and I quote, a comprehensive map of sex, gender, and sexuality, the editors and co-authors of the recent volume Fuckology, Critical Essays on John Money's Diagnostic Concepts, observe the strident defense of Money mounted by former students and collaborators. Among them is Anke Ehrhardt, who emphasized in a heartfelt obituary Money's wide-ranging contributions. He was a founding member of the new field of psychoendocrinology, responsible for important changes to the treatment of variations in anatomy and desires. It was Money who coined the term paraphilias to replace the pejorative perversions, and sexual orientation to replace sexual preference. This change was crucial for Money, according to Ehrhardt, because, she writes, our attractions are not completely voluntary, nor simply matters of free choice or taste. Ehrhardt was at pains to highlight the contributions that Money had made to the lives and self-conceptions of those who would become his harshest critics. She was certainly not alone. When I asked him how it could be that Money appeared to have two faces, Devore responded without hesitation that the tension between the sort of open curiosity Money demonstrated toward his older teen and adult patients and the stubborn defense of his academic work came from, as Devore put it, the institution. Devore takes his teacher's aspiration to create a Linnaean taxonomy of sex, gender, and desire as a means with which he would find distinction. Recognition of the sort Money sought, to be the first, the best, the most influential, required not only the shaping of a classificatory theoretical apparatus, but clinical evidence, proof of its success. At an institution that prided itself on being world-class, professional respect and renown were valued above all else. Reflecting on his experience with Money at Johns Hopkins, Devore credits his teacher with providing both a model for the compassionate clinician Devore has proven to be over the last 2 decades, and a cautionary tale that made the practice of academic psychology, which demands the blurring of lines between research subjects and patients, unappealing to him. From Devore's account, perhaps we may affirm that Money did indeed exhibit an admirable curiosity, a generous and compassionate curiosity, which provided Devore and Money's patients with, as Ehrhardt wrote, a haven in a world too fearful or threatened to tolerate or support their bodily and affectional differences from some fantasized norm. But that same curiosity served also to elicit the details that would help Money to shape and structure what he believed would prove a master design of human identity and desire that at this historical moment insisted on surgically creating normal bodies from abnormal ones. Money and a growing number of specialists whose initial members were trained at Johns Hopkins applied the protocols he helped to formalize and shaped the standard of care not only in the US but throughout the West. Intersex patients then were both radically affirmed and tragically damaged by Money's work, which contained both genuine curiosity and powerful drives to normalization. So I have a brief conclusion. Curiosity's end. The institutional recognition John Money sought comes not from a desire to learn or even to know, but the belief that knowledge has been finally attained. What is celebrated and rewarded in such institutional recognition is not a spirit of inquiry, but its conclusion. Reflecting on the value assigned to this achievement, we may recognize another dimension of the ethical violation entailed by the standard of care and the end of curiosity it seems to promise. In the crushing silence experienced by many individuals subjected to the standard of care to which Money's work centrally contributed, we find not simply a refusal to or prescription against talking about a child's physical difference, but a stifling of the desire to learn about that difference and why it has been figured as a problem. This stifling was intentional. It was expressly designed to foreclose questions about a child's unusual anatomy or what this might mean about that child's desires, but was also a means to prevent asking questions about the fact of intersex itself. But if this intention was shaped by a paternalistic effort to prevent discomfort or doubt on the part of the child, and perhaps especially the child's parents, these interventions also had the effect of stifling curiosity about ourselves and our world that are at the heart of wonder. If there's a positive lesson to take from Money's work, it lies in the creative and life-affirming value in the curiosity that could be both welcomed and encouraged in teens like Peggy Cadet's cousin and in adults like DeVore. Understanding how its stifling can so encumber the prospects for a well-lived life, DeVore would go on to build a life's work in its encouragement, supporting and fostering a movement of individuals who would find in the reclamation of curiosity a righteous anger and new prospects for the wonder, desire, and the delight that the revelation of injustice may bring. Thank you. I'm told that I have some time for questions.
it's not an easy question, and I'm always wondering at the heart of the matter is whether intersex is different from other medical conditions. Is it a medical condition or not? And I would say, or is it an exception, or as I like to call it, an intersection? If it is a medical condition, then there is a natural sort of curiosity from the medical field, especially if it's rare conditions, to say, how are we going to transfer this knowledge? How are physicians not going to be shocked to see something unusual? So it's a real debate. Of course, if it's not a medical condition, then the debate closes. So in my practice, I'm the chief medical genetics here. We see extraordinarily rare conditions, and of course, when they're extraordinarily rare, like one in a lifetime, not having the opportunity to provide trainings either directly or through photography, the opportunity to either observe, discuss, talk to families is difficult for future generations of physicians. So I'm torn in this debate. I understand both facets, but I don't have a good answer.
There's a lot in what you said. I'll try to pick up on a couple. I think that I've said before that I think that one of the positive possibilities of the nomenclature DSD was the possibility that intersex could be treated as a disorder like any other, and not as a disorder like no others, which I think is how it's previously been cast. I wouldn't back away from that position, but I think that it's not going to work. And I think part of why the nomenclature will be a failure is that the focus remains on the unusual anatomies and not on the medical problems for which those unusual anatomies can just be a symptom, right? But not itself something interesting for medicine. So I think that's truly unfortunate. So no, of course we don't want doctors to be surprised or react with disgust, as lots of narratives have attested. But surely there are other means of doing that besides bringing a large group of residents into a hospital room. That, I think, is also not exclusive to intersex. But I think this is one of those places where the problems which may be so obvious in the case of intersex could also help us understand why that's a problem for children with any number of other things that seem to be about the child's self and not just like a body part. It's not a leg wound, but it touches on something about what others take and what a child, him or herself or themselves, may see as central to who they are. And as soon as we go into that territory, I think we have to think about other techniques, other approaches. And I think that I've said in another context how impressed I've been by the work of Atul Gawande in this respect. He's talking about, in On Being Mortal, he's talking about problems, again, this is the American context, but the problems of how we treat old age and dementia. And in that book, he very movingly points to what seem like very obvious remedies for that. And he's got all these beautiful examples of that. And when I read that book, I thought, Yeah, you know, it's incredibly groundbreaking, these changes, and they're easy and obvious. Why can't we do that? We have Edgardo Menviel present here today. He began the gender variant clinic at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. And so that's another case where he did something really revolutionary in not talking about children with gender identity disorder, but children who are gender variant, and seeing the problem of gender variance not as located in the body and identity of the child, but in the response that the child had to deal with in the parents, in the neighborhood, in the school. And I think we can do better. That's the short answer to the question you're asking.
I have a short comment. Thank you for a very thoughtful lecture. And it's interesting to raise the question of what is the medical condition. I think we need to reflect upon that for a while. So for me, as a physician, it is natural that if a patient or if a person requests treatment, then we have to provide treatment, and then we have to reflect upon it as a medical condition without any prejudice, of course. So I think it's dangerous to go too far and say that this is not a medical condition. It means we won't provide any treatment. We won't provide any hormonal treatment. We do not want to, or we wouldn't be curious, to use the right word, about the consequences of potential treatment and so on. Thank you.
Let me push back a little bit here. There are some serious medical problems associated with intersex conditions, the most obvious of which is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which affects both male and female children. But there are problems that can arise because of these differences or variations in sex development over the lifespan. I think we have to pay attention to the fact that the only real training for variations in sex development is pediatric training. When these are often conditions that affect an individual over the lifespan, where is the training for adults who no longer have gonads? Why do folks with androgen insensitivity syndrome, who are genetic males and who in the complete form identify as females, I bring that case up, I should say, because it's the one case where there are adult practitioners. Why is it a reproductive endocrinologist who's in charge of their care? Why is that the specialist? So in part, my response to you is not, part of what I hear you saying is, no, we really do, you're making a case for the medicalization of children. And I want to say, maybe, but I think that we need, that we have to attend to the absence of medicalization of real medical problems throughout the lifespan. The attention and the research is not going there. And I find that incomprehensible. So again, we can do better. Can't we do better? People deserve medical care. If we see that as a right, then in the same way that it was a revelation when it turned out that medical trials and research had to not only focus in the US on white men, but also women. I think we've got a population here who deserve caring practitioners who are knowledgeable about their conditions and things like hormone replacement when it's needed or desired.
Thank you. I think we need to move to the